The stagecoach driver's scream was the last sound Caroline Shelton heard before the world tipped sideways and the mountains swallowed her whole. It was the autumn of 1878, and she had been running for 6 days, first by train from Boston to Omaha, then by rail again to Cheyenne, and finally by this rattling, dust-choked stagecoach bound for the mining settlements of Montana Territory, where she had told herself, over and over, that no one would know her name and no one would know her face. She had left behind a mansion on Beacon Hill, a father who loved his ledgers more than his daughter, and a wedding dress already fitted to her body for a man she had met exactly 4 times, a widower twice her age named Harold Ashby Pemberton, who smelled of tobacco and old money and who spoke to her the way a man speaks to a horse he intends to break. She had not asked to be sold. That was the word she used in her mind, though her father called it a merger, an alliance between the Shelton textile fortune and the Pemberton shipping lines, a business arrangement dressed up in lace and orange blossoms. She was 21 years old, and she had spent every day of those 21 years being told what she would wear, what she would say, whom she would marry, and she had decided, on the night before her wedding, that she would rather disappear into the wilderness of the American West than spend one more hour being owned. The stagecoach lurched again, and Caroline gripped the leather strap above her head with both hands as the wheels screamed against stone. Outside the window, the road had narrowed to a shelf of rock clinging to the side of a mountain, and rain was falling in sheets that turned the dirt beneath the horses into a treacherous soup. There were only 2 other passengers inside the coach, an elderly preacher and his wife, and both of them were praying aloud when the axle finally gave way beneath them with a sound like a rifle shot. The world became a blur of tumbling shadows and shattering wood. Caroline felt herself thrown against the door, then through it, and then there was only the wet, cold ground rushing up to meet her before everything went black. When she opened her eyes again, the rain had softened to a drizzle, and the light had changed from the gray of storm clouds to the deeper gray of dusk. Her head throbbed with a pain that made her stomach turn, and when she tried to sit up, a bolt of fire shot through her left ankle that made her cry out before she could stop herself. "Easy now." The voice came from somewhere above her, low and rough, like stones rubbing together underwater. Caroline's vision swam, and for a moment she saw only a shape, enormous and dark against the darker trees, before the shape crouched down beside her and resolved itself into a man. He was unlike any man she had ever seen in the drawing rooms of Boston. His shoulders were broad enough to block out what remained of the sky, and his arms, bared to the elbow beneath a rolled-up flannel shirt, were corded with muscle earned from years of labor rather than leisure. His hair was dark and long, falling past his collar in a way no gentleman back east would have permitted, and a close-cropped beard covered a jaw that looked as though it had been carved rather than grown. His eyes, when they found hers in the fading light, were the color of pine needles, and there was something steady in them that made the panic in her chest ease, just slightly, in spite of everything. "My name is Matthew Hayes," he said, his voice gentling as though he could sense the fear radiating off her. "I have a cabin not far from here. I heard the coach go over the edge. Are you hurt bad, miss?" "My ankle," Caroline managed, her teeth chattering now that the shock was beginning to wear off and the cold was setting in. "The others, the driver, the preacher, I already found them," Matthew said, and something in his voice told her the news was not good before he spoke it. "The driver did not survive the fall. The preacher's wife has a broken arm, but she is alive, and I have already carried them both up to my cabin. The preacher himself is shaken but whole. I came back down for you." Caroline felt the tears come then, hot and sudden, and she hated herself for crying in front of a stranger, but the horror of the crash and the death of a man who had smiled at her that very morning was too much to hold inside. Matthew did not reach for her the way she feared he might. He simply waited, kneeling in the mud, letting her weep until the worst of it passed, and when she finally looked up at him again, embarrassed, he offered her nothing but a steady, patient expression. "I am going to have to carry you," he said. "Your ankle will not bear weight, not tonight. Is that acceptable to you, miss?" She noticed, even in her exhaustion, that he had asked. Not commanded, not assumed. Asked as though her answer mattered. "Yes," she whispered. "Thank you." He lifted her as though she weighed nothing at all, one arm beneath her knees and the other supporting her back, and Caroline found herself pressed against a chest that felt like warm granite, solid and unshakable, as he began to climb the mountain trail with the sure-footedness of a man who had walked it 1,000 times before. She should have felt afraid, alone in the wilderness in the arms of a stranger twice her size, but instead she felt something she had not felt in longer than she could remember. She felt safe. The cabin, when they reached it, was small but sturdy, built of thick logs chinked with mud and moss, with a stone chimney at one end from which smoke was already curling into the darkening sky. Inside, a fire crackled in a wide hearth, and the preacher, a thin man named Reverend Aldous Whitfield, rose from a rough-hewn chair the moment they entered. "Thank the Lord," he said. "We feared the worst for you, my dear." Matthew laid Caroline gently on a narrow bed against the far wall, a bed that she would later learn was his own, given up without a second thought, and knelt to examine her ankle with careful, businesslike hands that never lingered anywhere they should not. "It is not broken," he said after a moment, pressing his thumb gently along the bone in a way that made her wince. "Badly sprained, I think. You will need to stay off it for a time." "How long is a time?" Caroline asked, though even as she said it she realized she had nowhere else to be. No one in this territory knew her face. No one would come looking for a woman with no name in a cabin at the edge of the world. The thought, rather than frightening her, filled her with a strange and giddy relief. "A week," Matthew said, "perhaps 2. The preacher's wife, a kind-faced woman named Martha Whitfield, her arm now splinted with strips of cloth and 2 flat pieces of wood, spoke up from where she sat near the fire. "We are grateful for your hospitality, Mr. Hayes, but we cannot impose upon you for 2 weeks. My husband and I are expected in Helena. There is a congregation waiting for us." "There is a supply wagon that comes through the valley every 10 days, Matthew said. "It will be here in 3, maybe 4. I can take you as far as the wagon road on my mule, Reverend, if your arm allows travel, ma'am, and from there the wagon will carry you the rest of the way to Helena." "But the young lady," he glanced at Caroline, "cannot travel on that ankle, not for some time." Caroline felt a flutter of panic at the thought of being separated from the only 2 people in the territory who knew her, even briefly, but she also understood the practicality of what he said. She had no belongings of value left, her small carpet bag having been lost somewhere in the wreckage of the coach, save for a locket that had been her mother's, tucked safely inside her bodice, and a small amount of money sewn into the hem of her traveling dress. She had nothing to offer this stranger for his kindness except her word. "I will not be a burden," she said. "I can cook and mend, and I will pay you for my keep the moment I am able." Something flickered across Matthew's face then, something that might have been amusement, though it was gone before she could name it. "I did not ask for payment, miss. I only asked if you were hurt." "Caroline," she said suddenly. "My name is Caroline Shelton." She watched his eyes for any flicker of recognition, any sign that the name meant something to him. That word of a runaway Boston heiress had somehow already crossed 1,000 miles of prairie and mountain to reach this remote corner of Montana territory. But there was nothing in his expression save simple courtesy. "Miss Shelton," he said, with a small nod, as though the name were no different from any other. "You are welcome here as long as you need." That night, after the Whitfields had settled onto pallets near the fire and Matthew had retreated to sleep in the small barn attached to the side of the cabin where he kept his mule and his traps, Caroline lay awake in the narrow bed, listening to the wind move through the pines outside, and allowed herself, for the first time in 6 days, to imagine a future that was entirely her own. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that Caroline found, to her surprise, deeply comforting. On the morning after the crash, Matthew rode out at first light with the Reverend Whitfield seated behind him on the sturdy mule, and returned some hours later to fetch Martha, ferrying her carefully down the mountain trail to the point where the wagon road began, promising the anxious woman that her husband would be waiting there when she arrived. When he returned to the cabin in the late afternoon, dust upon his boots and a look of quiet satisfaction on his face, he found Caroline sitting up in the bed, her ankle propped upon a folded blanket, attempting to mend a tear in his spare shirt with a needle and thread she had found in a small wooden box near the hearth. "You did not have to do that," he said, setting down a sack of flour he had carried up from where the supply wagon had left provisions at the crossroads. "I wanted to be useful," Caroline said. "I have spent my whole life being decorative. I find I would rather be useful." Matthew's brow furrowed slightly at that, though he said nothing, only crossed to the hearth to check on the pot of beans she had managed to set to simmer despite her injured ankle, using the crutch he had fashioned for her from a forked tree branch the night before. He tasted the beans, and something like surprise crossed his weathered face. "These are good," he said. "You sound shocked." "I am shocked," he admitted, a rare smile breaking through his beard, and Caroline felt something warm unfurl in her chest at the sight of it, the way a man's whole face could change when he allowed himself a moment of genuine feeling. Most folks who come through this territory from back east do not know one end of a cook fire from the other. "I am not most folks," Caroline said, and there was an edge in her voice that surprised even her, a bitterness she had not meant to let slip free. Matthew studied her for a long moment, his green eyes searching her face in a way that made her want to look away, and yet somehow made her want to be seen even more. "No," he said finally. "I do not suppose you are." He did not press her for the story of how a well-spoken young woman with soft hands and a Boston accent had come to be alone on a stagecoach bound for a rough mining territory with no family and no belongings, and she was grateful for it, though she found in the days that followed that the silence between them was not empty but full of questions neither of them asked and answers neither of them offered, and somehow that felt like enough. She learned, in bits and pieces gathered over shared meals and quiet evenings by the fire, that Matthew Hayes had come to the mountains 8 years before, in 1870, after the war had taken something from him that he did not name and did not seem inclined to name, something that had made the crowded streets of Ohio unbearable, and the silence of the wilderness a mercy rather than a punishment. He trapped in the winter, selling pelts to traders who came through twice a year, and in the summer he worked a small claim he had staked near a creek that ran silver with the promise of gold, though he confessed, with the same wry half-smile, that the promise had never quite been fulfilled. "Then why stay?" Caroline asked one evening as they sat together on the rough bench outside the cabin door, watching the last light drain from a sky painted in shades of rose and violet above the black silhouette of the peaks. "Because it is quiet," Matthew said. "Because nobody up here expects me to be anything other than what I am. Because the mountains do not care who your father was or what he wanted for you." Caroline turned to look at him then, startled, and found him watching her with an expression that told her he had guessed more of her story than she had told him. "How did you know?" she asked softly. "I did not know," he said, "not the particulars. But I know what it looks like when someone is running from something, Miss Shelton. I have seen it in my own reflection more mornings than I care to admit." She told him then, haltingly at first and then in a rush, the whole of it. She told him about her father, Edmund Shelton, and the textile mills that had made his fortune and hollowed out his heart, about the debts he did not speak of, but that she had overheard in whispered conversations behind closed doors, about Harold Pemberton and his cold eyes and his colder hands, about the wedding dress hanging in her closet like a shroud, and about the morning she had climbed out her bedroom window with nothing but a carpet bag and the money sewn into her hem, and walked 3 miles to the train station in the dark, rather than walk down the aisle in the light. When she finished, her voice was raw and her eyes were wet, and she braced herself for pity, or worse, for judgment, for some remark about a woman's duty to her family that she had heard 100 times before from 100 different mouths. But Matthew only reached out slowly and covered her hand with his own, his palm rough and warm and impossibly gentle, and said, "You did not run away from your life, Caroline. You ran toward it." It was the first time he had used her given name, and something in the way he said it, softly, as though it were something precious, made her breath catch in her throat. The weeks that followed her recovery brought a change in the shape of her days that Caroline had never known before. She learned to set snares for rabbits under Matthew's patient instruction, her soft hands growing rough and capable as autumn deepened into the first hard frosts of the season. She learned to render fat for soap, to smoke fish over a low fire, to read the sky for coming weather in the way the clouds gathered over the western peaks. She learned that Matthew Hayes, for all his silence, was a man of deep and careful thought, who read from a small collection of worn books by firelight each evening, poetry mostly, and philosophy, gifts, he told her, from an old trapper who had taught him the ways of the mountains before dying of a fever some years back. She learned, too, the shape of his body as he worked, the way the muscles in his back moved beneath his shirt when he split firewood, the strength in his forearms when he hauled water from the creek, the careful precision of his hands when he cleaned his rifle each evening by the fire. She told herself she was only observing, only curious about a life so different from anything she had known, but she knew, even as she told herself this, that it was not entirely true. Something had begun to grow in her chest in the weeks since the stagecoach crash, something warm and terrifying and entirely unfamiliar, and she suspected, from the way Matthew's eyes lingered on her when he thought she did not notice, that she was not alone in feeling it. The first snow came early that year, in the last week of October, blanketing the high peaks in white while the valley below still clung to the last gold and rust colors of autumn. Caroline stood in the cabin doorway one morning, wrapped in a blanket against the cold, and watched the flakes drift down through the pines with a sense of wonder she had never known in the manicured gardens of Beacon Hill. "It is beautiful," she said, as Matthew came to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him even in the winter air. "It will not stay beautiful for long," he said. "Snow up here can turn deadly faster than you would believe. We will need to make sure the wood is stacked high and the traps are checked before the pass is close." "Close?" Caroline turned to look at him, a flicker of alarm crossing her face. "You mean we would be trapped here, unable to leave?" "Trapped is not the word I would use," Matthew said, and there was something careful in his tone, something that told her he had been thinking about this moment for some time. "But yes, once the heavy snows come, the trail down to the valley becomes impassable until spring. If you wish to leave before then to go on to Helena or wherever you intended, you would need to go soon." Caroline was quiet for a long moment, watching the snow fall, feeling the weight of the decision before her settle onto her shoulders. She had come west with no clear destination, only the desperate need to be anywhere that was not Boston, anywhere that was not the life her father had chosen for her. She had no family in Helena, no prospects, no plan beyond the vague notion of finding work as a seamstress or a teacher in some small town where no one asked too many questions about a woman traveling alone. "And if I wish to stay?" she asked quietly, not daring to look at him. She felt him go very still beside her. "Then you would be welcome to stay," Matthew said, his voice rough, "for as long as you like, even through the winter." Even knowing what people might say, a woman living alone with a man who is no relation to her. "I have never much cared what people say," Matthew said. "And there is a preacher not 4 days' ride from here, when the weather allows, who could make things proper between us, if that was something you wanted. I would not ask you to stay in scandal, Caroline. I would only ask you to stay." Caroline turned to look at him then, and found him watching her with an expression of such naked vulnerability that it took her breath away. This enormous, powerful man who could carry her up a mountainside as though she weighed nothing, looking at her as though her answer could break him. "Are you asking me to marry you, Matthew Hayes?" she asked, half in wonder and half in disbelief, though her heart was pounding so hard she was certain he could hear it. "I am asking you to choose," he said. "I know what it is to have your life decided for you by other people's wants. I would not do that to you, not for anything. But I am telling you that if you chose to stay, if you chose me, I would spend every day trying to be worthy of that choice." The snow continued to fall around them, softening the edges of the world, and Caroline felt something inside her that had been clenched tight since the night she climbed out her bedroom window finally begin to loosen. "I have never chosen anything for myself before," she said softly. "Not really, not until I ran." "Then choose now," Matthew said. "Not because you have nowhere else to go, not because it is convenient or safe. Choose because it is what you want." Caroline stepped closer to him, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes, and reached up to press her palm against the rough wool of his coat, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her hand. "I choose you," she said, and the words felt like the truest thing she had ever spoken. "I choose this. I choose to stay." Matthew's hands came up to cradle her face, careful and reverent, as though she were something rare and precious. And when he kissed her, softly at first and then with a growing hunger that mirrored her own, Caroline felt the last of her old life fall away like snow melting from a warm hand, leaving only this moment, this man, this choice that was entirely, finally her own. They did not marry that day, for the preacher was too far and the weather too uncertain, but they made a promise to each other beside the fire that night, a promise as binding to both of them as any words spoken before a congregation. And when Matthew finally led her to his bed and she went to him without hesitation or fear, she understood for the first time in her life what it meant to give herself freely, without coercion, without obligation, simply because her heart demanded it. The winter that followed was the happiest of Caroline's life, though it was also the hardest work she had ever known. The snows came heavy and relentless by mid-November, burying the cabin in drifts that reached the windowsills, and Matthew taught her the rhythms of survival in a world where a single mistake, a fire allowed to die, a door left unlatched against a hungry bear, could mean death. She learned to shoot his second rifle, an old but well-maintained Winchester, and though her first attempt sent the recoil knocking her backward into the snow, by January she could bring down a rabbit at 40 paces with steady hands. In the evenings, when the wind howled outside and the fire crackled warm and gold within, Matthew would read to her from his small collection of books, his deep voice giving new life to verses she had once found tedious in her tutor's dry recitations. And Caroline would lean against his broad chest, listening to the words vibrate through him, feeling more content than she had ever felt in all the rooms of silk and marble she had left behind. There were harder moments too, moments when the isolation pressed close, and Caroline found herself weeping without quite knowing why, grief for a mother she barely remembered, for a childhood spent performing rather than living, for the family she had left behind who might, even now, believe her dead in some ditch beside the road, rather than alive and warm and loved in a cabin in the Montana mountains. Matthew never rushed her through these moments, never told her to be strong or to set aside her sorrow. He simply held her, his massive arms wrapped around her slight frame, until the storm inside her passed as surely as the storms outside eventually always did. "Do you think he looks for me?" she asked him one night in February, the question emerging from some dark place she had been avoiding for months. "My father," Matthew considered this with the same careful thoughtfulness he brought to everything. "I think a man like you have described cares more for appearances than for people," he said finally. "I think he is more likely to have told his society friends that his daughter died of a fever than to admit she ran from a marriage he arranged. Men like that do not search for what shames them. They bury it." Caroline found, to her own surprise, that this thought did not wound her as much as she expected. There was a kind of freedom in being buried, in being allowed, finally, to disappear from a story that had never truly been about her at all. By March, the snows had begun to soften, and the first green shoots pushed up through the melting drifts along the creek bed, and Matthew announced one morning, with a look of quiet excitement he could not quite hide, that the pass would be clear enough within the week to make the journey to the small settlement of Deer Lodge, where a circuit preacher was known to hold services on the first Sunday of each month. "Are you asking me to marry you again?" Caroline teased, though her heart had begun to race the moment he mentioned the preacher. "I am asking you to let me make it official," Matthew said, taking her hands in his. "You are already my heart, Caroline. I would like the world to know it too." They made the journey on Matthew's mule, and a second horse he had traded for with a passing trapper, picking their way carefully down trails still slick with melting snow, and arrived in Deer Lodge on a bright, cold Sunday morning in late March, to find the small wooden church already filling with settlers and miners and their families, drawn from cabins and claims scattered across the surrounding valleys. The preacher, a weathered man named Reverend Josiah Carter, agreed readily enough to perform the ceremony, and within an hour Caroline Shelton stood before him in a borrowed dress of pale blue calico, her hand held firmly in Matthew's, and became Caroline Hayes before a congregation of strangers who nonetheless cheered and wept and threw handfuls of dried flowers as though they had known her all their lives. "With this ring," Matthew said, sliding a simple band of gold onto her finger, a ring he had fashioned himself from a nugget found in his claim the previous summer, melted and shaped with a patience that spoke louder than any words of devotion, "I promise you a life that is entirely your own, for as long as I live and beyond it." Caroline could not speak for the tears that choked her throat, but she did not need words. She simply pressed her lips to his, before God and preacher and the assembled strangers of Deer Lodge, and felt, for the first time in her life, that her future belonged entirely to herself, and to the man who had never once tried to take it from her. They returned to the cabin as husband and wife, and the summer that followed was one of building and growing, as Matthew expanded the cabin with a second room, and Caroline planted a small garden of vegetables and herbs along the south-facing wall, using seeds she had carefully saved from the supply wagon stores. She wrote letters that summer too, careful and considered letters, not to her father, whom she had no wish to contact, but to a cousin in Boston named Eleanor, the only member of her family who had ever shown her true kindness, letting her know that she was alive and well and happier than she had ever been, though she asked that the information not be shared with anyone else in the family. Eleanor's reply, when it finally came in late August carried by the supply wagon, brought news that Caroline had not expected. Harold Pemberton, furious and humiliated by her disappearance on the eve of their wedding, had spread word through Boston society that she had died of a sudden fever while visiting relatives in the countryside, precisely as Matthew had predicted, rather than admit that his intended bride had fled rather than marry him. Edmund Shelton, Eleanor wrote, had aged considerably in the months since Caroline's disappearance, though whether from grief or from the collapse of the business arrangement Harold had angrily dissolved, Eleanor could not say for certain. He had not, as far as Eleanor knew, made any effort to search for his daughter, content, it seemed, to let the comfortable fiction of her death stand rather than face the truth of her escape. Caroline read the letter twice through, sitting on the bench outside the cabin while Matthew worked nearby, splitting wood for the coming winter with easy, powerful strokes that sent chips flying into the summer air, and found that the news which might once have devastated her now settled over her like a kind of closing door, quiet and final and strangely freeing. "He has already mourned me," she said, when Matthew came to sit beside her, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of one strong forearm. "In his own way, I do not think he will look for a ghost." "Does that trouble you?" Matthew asked, searching her face with the careful attention he always gave her, as though her feelings were a landscape worth studying in detail. "No," Caroline said, and found that she meant it entirely. "I think it means I am finally, truly free." The autumn of that first year brought a visitor to the cabin that neither of them had expected. A young woman named Sarah Corbin, barely 18 years old, who stumbled up the mountain trail one evening in October with torn skirts and desperate eyes. Fleeing, as Caroline soon learned, a marriage forced upon her by her stepfather to a mining foreman 3 times her age who had already buried 2 wives. Caroline recognized the fear in the girl's eyes, the particular terror of a young woman who had been told her entire life that her wants did not matter, and she took Sarah in without a moment's hesitation, tending to the blisters on her feet and the exhaustion in her thin frame with the same gentle care Matthew had once shown to her. "You cannot stay here forever," Matthew said gently to the girl once she had eaten and rested for 2 days. "But I know a family in Helena, the Whitfields, good people, a preacher and his wife, who would take you in and help you find honest work, if that is something you would want." Sarah's eyes filled with grateful tears at the mention of a way forward that did not involve returning to the man who had claimed her against her will, and Caroline felt a fierce, protective satisfaction at being able to offer this girl the same gift that Matthew had once offered her, the simple, radical gift of a choice. "Why would you help me?" Sarah asked Caroline quietly, on the morning that Matthew prepared to escort her down the mountain to the wagon road. "You do not know me at all." "Because someone once helped me," Caroline said simply, "when I had run from a life I did not choose, with nothing but the clothes on my back and no one in the world who knew my name. I intend to spend the rest of my life paying that kindness forward, wherever I find someone who needs it." Sarah reached the Whitfield safely, and wrote to Caroline in the following months to report that she had found work as a teacher's assistant in the growing town, work she found deeply satisfying, and that she had, in fact, met a young rancher at a church social who treated her with a gentleness she had never known she was permitted to expect from a man. Caroline read the letter aloud to Matthew by the fire, her voice thick with emotion, and felt something settle into place inside her, a sense of purpose that went beyond her own happiness, though that happiness, too, grew deeper with each passing season. Winter came again, gentler than the first, for they were prepared this time with a full store of dried meat and preserved vegetables and firewood stacked high against the cabin's north wall. It was during this second winter, in the deep cold of January 1880, that Caroline first suspected she might be carrying a child, a suspicion that Matthew received with an expression of such overwhelming joy that Caroline laughed through her own happy tears at the sight of this enormous, capable man, reduced to something like wonder at the thought of becoming a father. "Are you frightened?" she asked him one night, as they lay together beneath heavy quilts while the wind howled outside, her hand resting over the small, still flat curve of her belly. "Terrified," Matthew admitted, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I do not know the first thing about raising a child, but I know what it is to grow up feeling like a burden, like something to be managed rather than loved. I know I do not want that for our child." "You will not be like that," Caroline said with certainty. "I have never known a gentler man in all my life, Matthew Hayes, for all your size and strength. Our child will know nothing but love in this house." Their son was born in September of 1880, on a warm afternoon with the mountain aspens turning gold outside the cabin window, delivered with the help of a midwife from Deer Lodge, whom Matthew had ridden 3 days to fetch the moment Caroline's labor began, refusing to leave her side even when the older woman insisted he wait outside as was proper. They named him Thomas, after Matthew's own father, a gentle man who had died when Matthew was young, and Caroline held her son in her arms for the first time and felt a love so fierce and immediate that it nearly stole the breath from her lungs. "He has your eyes," she murmured to Matthew, who sat beside the bed, his large hand dwarfing the tiny fist that had curled around his finger. "He has your strength," Matthew replied. "I watched you bring him into this world, Caroline. I have never seen anything so brave in all my life, not even in the war." Life continued in its rhythms after Thomas's birth, the seasons turning one into another, the cabin growing to accommodate their expanding family as Matthew added a third room the following summer. In 1882, a daughter arrived, whom they named Grace, for the mercy that had brought Caroline to this mountain in the first place. And Caroline found herself, in the busy years that followed, transformed from a young woman who had known nothing of self-determination into a woman who ran a household, managed a garden that fed her family through long winters, and taught her children not only their letters but the deeper lesson that had shaped her own life. That a person's worth was not determined by the plans others made for them, but by the choices they made for themselves. It was in 1883 that trouble finally found them, though not in the form either of them had expected. A stranger arrived at the cabin one autumn afternoon, a thin, well-dressed man who introduced himself as a private investigator named Silas Cobb, hired. He explained with an oily sort of politeness that made Caroline's skin crawl, by a Mr. Edmund Shelton of Boston, who had recently come into possession of information, suggesting that his daughter, long believed dead, might in fact be residing somewhere in the Montana Territory. Caroline felt the old fear rise in her chest, sharp and cold, the fear of being found, of being dragged back into a life she had left behind, of being told once again that her choices belonged to someone else. But when she looked at Matthew, standing beside her with Thomas, now 3 years old, held protectively against his hip, and saw the steady, unshakable calm in his green eyes, she found her own courage rising to match his. "I am Caroline Hayes," she said clearly, before the investigator could say another word. "I have no wish to be reunited with Edmund Shelton. Whatever business brought him to seek me out, you may tell him that his daughter died on the road west, exactly as he told his society friends. The woman standing before you is someone else entirely, a woman he has never known." Silas Cobb studied her for a long moment, his eyes flicking between her face and the tintype photograph he produced from his coat pocket, a formal portrait Caroline recognized from before her flight, a young woman with carefully arranged curls and a joyless smile. "That woman is not me," Caroline said, meeting his gaze steadily. "That woman never really existed at all. She was a performance, Mr. Cobb, put on for the benefit of a father who never once asked what she wanted from her own life. I am asking you to leave now, and to tell whoever sent you that your search has reached a dead end." Whether it was the steel in her voice, or the massive, silent presence of Matthew Hayes looming beside her with an expression that promised trouble should the investigator press further, or simply the practical calculation that a woman who wished to remain hidden in the vast wilderness of Montana Territory could disappear again long before any legal claim could be pressed, Silas Cobb chose, in the end, to accept her answer. He tipped his hat, cast one final searching look around the modest but clearly happy homestead, the neat garden, the children's toys scattered near the door, the obvious devotion between the woman before him and the enormous man at her side, and turned to make his way back down the mountain trail. "He may return," Matthew said quietly, once the investigator had disappeared from sight, his arm coming around Caroline's shoulders in a gesture that was equal parts comfort and protection. "He may," Caroline agreed. "But I am no longer the frightened girl who climbed out a bedroom window in the dark, Matthew. I have built a life here. I have a family, a home, a purpose. No investigator, no father, no man from my old life has any power over that anymore. I will not let fear steal what we have built." Silas Cobb did not return, though word reached them the following spring, through the same network of trappers and traders that carried all news through the territory, that Edmund Shelton had passed away that winter of a sudden apoplexy, his fortune considerably diminished by poor investments in the years since his daughter's disappearance, and that no further inquiries had been made regarding the fate of his lost daughter. Caroline received the news with a complicated grief, mourning not the man her father had been, but the relationship they might have had he ever once seen her as a person rather than an asset to be leveraged. She wept for an evening, and Matthew held her through it without judgment, and by morning she found that the weight of that old life had finally, truly lifted from her shoulders. The years that followed brought their own share of hardships, as life in the mountains always did. There was the winter of 1885, when a fever swept through the valley and took the life of young Sarah Corbin's own infant daughter, a loss that Caroline grieved alongside her friend, with the particular sorrow of a mother who understood too well what such a loss would mean. There was the summer of 1887, when a wildfire swept close enough to the cabin that Matthew and Caroline spent 3 desperate days digging trenches and clearing brush to protect their home, working side by side with a determination that only deepened the bond between them, until the fire finally turned aside, spared by a shift in the wind that Matthew, ever practical, credited to good fortune, and Caroline, in her private heart, credited to something closer to Providence. Through it all, their family grew. A second son, William, arrived in 1885, followed by another daughter, Mary, in 1888, each birth bringing its own moment of terror and its own overwhelming joy, each child raised in the particular freedom that both Caroline and Matthew had determined, from the very beginning, would define their household. There would be no arranged marriages in this family, no children sold to settle debts or secure alliances, no daughters told that their only worth lay in the advantageous match they could make. Caroline made this promise to herself the day Grace was born, and renewed it with each child that followed. And Matthew, who understood better than most the particular cruelty of a life not chosen freely, stood beside her in that promise without wavering. By 1890, the cabin that had once housed a single mountain man and his traps had grown into a proper homestead, with a barn for the horses and mule, a smokehouse for preserving meat through the long winters, and a schoolhouse that Matthew had helped build in the growing settlement that had sprung up in the valley below, where Caroline herself taught several days a week, having discovered in herself a gift for teaching that she had never known during her own stifled education back east. Thomas, now 10 years old, had grown tall and quick like his father, with an easy way with horses that made him the envy of the other boys in the valley, while Grace, at 8, had inherited her mother's sharp mind and her father's quiet steadiness, already showing an interest in the herbal remedies that the local midwife had begun teaching her. It was on a warm evening in June of that year, as Caroline sat on the porch of the home they had built together, watching her 4 children play in the last golden light of day, while Matthew tended to the horses nearby, that she found herself overcome by a wave of gratitude so profound it brought tears to her eyes. "What is it?" Matthew asked, noticing her expression as he came to sit beside her, his hands still smelling faintly of horse and leather and the good, honest work of the day. "I was just thinking," Caroline said, leaning into the solid warmth of him, "about the woman I was when you found me on that mountain trail. I did not know then what it meant to choose anything for myself. I did not know that a life could feel like this, like something I had built with my own hands rather than something handed to me by someone else's plans." "You built it," Matthew said. "I only stood beside you while you did." "You gave me the choice," Caroline said. "That was the gift, Matthew. Not the cabin, not the safety, not even the love, though I treasure all of it beyond measure. The gift was that you never once tried to decide for me what my life should look like. You only asked me what I wanted, and then you let me have it." Matthew's arm tightened around her shoulders, and he pressed a kiss to the top of her head, the same gesture of tenderness he had offered 1,000 times in the 12 years since he had carried her up that mountain trail with a broken ankle and a heart full of fear. "I love you, Caroline Hayes," he said. "I loved you the moment I saw you lying in that mud, refusing to give up even though everything in your world had just been shattered. I have loved you every single day since, and I will love you every day that remains to me, for as long as I am fortunate enough to walk this earth beside you." "And I love you," Caroline replied, "more than I ever believed it was possible to love another person. You did not just save my life on that mountain, Matthew. You gave me the chance to live it." They sat together in the gathering dusk, watching their children play, listening to the sound of Grace's laughter mixing with the calls of the mountain birds settling into their evening roosts. And Caroline thought, as she often did in these quiet moments, of the terrified young woman who had climbed out a window in the dark of a Boston night, certain only that she would rather face the unknown dangers of the wilderness than the certain misery of a life chosen for her by someone else's ambitions. She had found, in the end, far more than mere escape. She had found a partner who saw her not as a possession to be managed or a debt to be settled, but as a person whose choices mattered, whose voice deserved to be heard, whose future was hers alone to shape. She had found, in the unlikely form of a silent mountain man with the strength to move mountains and the gentleness to never once misuse it, the love that every fairy tale had promised her, and that her old life had insisted did not exist for a woman of her station. As the last light faded behind the peaks and Matthew called the children in for supper, his deep voice carrying easily across the yard, Caroline rose from the porch and followed her family inside, into the warm glow of the home they had built together, and felt, as she felt every single day in this life she had chosen for herself, that she was exactly where she belonged. The years continued to unfold with the same steady rhythm, each season bringing its own labors and its own quiet joys, and the homestead that Matthew and Caroline had built continued to grow alongside their family. By 1895, Thomas had grown into a capable young man of 15, already spending long days working alongside his father on the claim and in the forests, learning the trapping trade that had first brought Matthew to these mountains, though the boy showed an equal fascination with the growing town below, where the railroad had finally arrived 2 years prior, bringing with it new opportunities that had never existed in the isolated territory of Caroline's arrival. Grace, at 13, had become something of a local legend for her skill with herbal medicine, having apprenticed herself to the aging midwife who had once delivered baby Thomas, and there was already talk in the valley of sending her east to a proper medical school when she came of age, an idea that filled Caroline with a fierce pride even as it reminded her, with a bittersweet ache, of how far her own daughter's opportunities exceeded anything Caroline herself had been offered at that age. It was in the spring of that year, 1895, that Caroline received a letter that stirred old memories she had thought long settled. The letter came from her cousin Eleanor, now married with children of her own, informing Caroline that Harold Pemberton, the man she had fled rather than marry 17 years before, had died the previous winter, his shipping empire having collapsed some years earlier amid a scandal involving fraudulent insurance claims that had left him disgraced and largely forgotten by the society that had once courted his favor. Caroline read the letter on the porch where she had once confessed her love to Matthew, and found that the news brought her no satisfaction, no sense of vindication, only a distant sort of pity for a man who had spent his life accumulating wealth and power only to lose both in the end, having never once, as far as she could tell from Eleanor's account, found anything resembling the happiness that Caroline herself had built in this mountain valley. "Does it trouble you?" Matthew asked when she showed him the letter that evening. "No," Caroline said, after considering the question carefully. "I think I feel sorry for him in a way. He spent his whole life trying to acquire things, people included, and in the end, he had nothing lasting to show for it. I have this." She gestured around them at the cabin, at the sound of their children's voices drifting from the barn where Thomas was teaching young William how to properly saddle a horse, at Matthew himself, still broad-shouldered and strong despite the gray now threading through his dark hair. "I have everything that matters, and I built it by choosing it, every single day, rather than having it handed to me or forced upon me. That is worth more than any fortune he ever accumulated." The following autumn brought a celebration that the whole valley turned out for, when Grace, now 14 and already showing the steady hands and quick mind that would eventually carry her to a nursing college in Denver, helped deliver her first baby without the supervision of the elder midwife, a healthy boy born to a young homesteading couple who had settled in the valley 2 years before. Caroline watched her daughter work with a competence and confidence that filled her with wonder, remembering the frightened, uncertain girl she herself had been at that age, taught only to be pleasing and decorative rather than capable and strong. "You did that," Matthew said to her quietly, watching the same scene from beside her at the edge of the gathered crowd, as neighbors congratulated the exhausted but joyful new parents. "You gave her the freedom to become whoever she wanted to be. That is your gift to her, Caroline, same as I gave to you." "We gave it together," Caroline corrected him gently. "I could not have raised her this way, could not have raised any of our children this way, if I had married a man who wanted a wife who simply agreed with him, who never questioned, who never chose anything for herself. You taught me, by example, what it looked like to respect another person's choices, even when it might have been easier or safer to make those choices for them." Matthew's hand found hers in the gathering dusk, and they stood together, watching their daughter accept the grateful thanks of the new parents, watching their sons work alongside the other men of the valley to build a celebratory bonfire for the evening's festivities, feeling the particular satisfaction of two people who had built not just a marriage, but an entire philosophy of living, and had watched it take root and flourish in the lives of their children. The turn of the century found the Hayes homestead thriving beyond anything either Matthew or Caroline could have imagined on that stormy autumn evening in 1878, when a stagecoach had tumbled off a mountain trail and changed both their lives forever. Thomas had taken over much of the trapping and ranching work, having married a local girl named Ellen the previous spring, while Grace had indeed gone east to study nursing, sending back letters filled with an excitement and ambition that made Caroline's heart swell with pride each time she read them aloud to the family gathered around the supper table. William, now 15, had inherited his father's quiet strength and his mother's sharp intelligence, splitting his time between the ranch work and his growing fascination with the mechanical innovations beginning to reach even this remote corner of Montana, while young Mary, 12 years old and full of the same fierce determination that had once carried her mother across 1,000 miles of unfamiliar territory, had already declared her intention to become a schoolteacher like Caroline. A plan that both her parents encouraged with equal enthusiasm. On a quiet evening in the autumn of 1900, more than 22 years after their first meeting on that fateful mountain trail, Matthew and Caroline sat together once more on the porch of their home, now surrounded by the sounds of grandchildren playing in the yard, for Thomas and Ellen had welcomed their first child that summer, a healthy daughter named after Caroline herself. "Do you remember," Caroline said softly, watching little Caroline toddle unsteadily across the grass under Thomas's watchful eye, "what you said to me that first winter about choosing?" "I remember," Matthew said, his voice, though deeper and rougher with age, still carrying the same steady warmth it always had. "I told you that you should choose because it was what you wanted, not because you had nowhere else to go." "I have thought about those words every day since," Caroline said. "Every choice I have made in the years since, staying with you, raising our children the way we have, all of it, I have thought of what it means to choose freely rather than to be chosen for. I think it is the greatest gift you ever gave me, greater even than your love, though I know you would say the two cannot be separated." "They cannot," Matthew agreed, drawing her closer against his side, his arm still strong despite the passage of over 2 decades, still capable of making her feel as safe and cherished as she had felt on that first terrible night when he had carried her up the mountain in the rain. "Loving you meant respecting your choices, Caroline. I could not have loved you any other way and called it love at all." Caroline turned to look at him then, this man who had given her not just his heart but the far rarer gift of her own agency, who had never once, in over 2 decades of marriage, tried to shape her into something other than exactly who she wanted to be, and felt the same overwhelming gratitude that had filled her on that porch a decade before, only deepened now by the accumulated weight of years spent building a life together, brick by careful brick, choice by careful choice. "I would choose you again," she said, "every single time in every single life. I chose you then because you gave me the freedom to choose, and I would choose you now because you have spent every day since honoring that freedom, never once taking it back." "Then I am the most fortunate man in the territory," Matthew said, pressing a kiss to her lips that carried within it all the tenderness and passion of that first kiss beside the winter fire, 22 years before, when two strangers had discovered, against every expectation either of them had carried into that mountain cabin, that love freely chosen was the only kind of love worth having. As the sun set behind the peaks that had witnessed the whole of their story, painting the sky in the same brilliant colors that had greeted Caroline on her very first evening in this valley, she rested her head against Matthew's shoulder and watched their family, their children and grandchild, gathered in the golden light of a life built entirely on the foundation of her own free choice, and knew, with absolute certainty, that she had found exactly where she belonged. Not because fate or family or circumstance had decided it for her, but because she herself, on a snowy morning in the winter of 1878, had chosen it, and had never once regretted that choice in all the years that followed. The mountains stood eternal around them, the same peaks that had once seemed so forbidding to a frightened young woman fleeing a life not her own, now standing as silent witness to the family she had built within their shadow, a testament to the simple, radical truth that Matthew Hayes had offered her that first winter, and that she had carried in her heart every day since. That a life truly lived must first be a life truly chosen, and that love, real love, asks nothing more of us than the freedom to become exactly who we are meant to be. In the years that followed, Caroline and Matthew watched their children scatter and settle, some remaining in the valley they had grown to love, others venturing further into the changing world of a new century, but all of them carrying forward the lesson their parents had taught by example rather than by lecture, that every person deserves the dignity of choosing their own path, and that the truest love does not demand submission, but offers, instead, the steady support to become whoever one is meant to become. Grace returned from her studies to establish the Valley's first proper clinic, marrying a young doctor she had met in Denver, who shared her commitment to caring for the mining families and homesteaders who had no other access to medical care. William eventually moved to Helena to work with the growing railroad companies, applying his mechanical curiosity to engines and machinery, while Mary, true to her early ambitions, became a beloved schoolteacher in the very schoolhouse her mother had helped establish decades before. Matthew and Caroline grew old together in the home they had built with their own hands, watching the wilderness around them slowly give way to the advancing tide of settlement and progress, watching new families arrive on the same roads that had once carried a runaway heiress into an uncertain future. And always, whenever a frightened traveler or a desperate young woman found their way to the Hayes homestead seeking shelter or guidance, Caroline made certain they were welcomed with the same unconditional kindness that had once saved her own life, for she never forgot, not for a single day of the many decades that followed, what it had meant to be given the simple, precious gift of her own. Free choice, offered by a silent mountain man with gentle hands and a heart large enough to hold an entire life's worth of love, freely given and freely returned, exactly as it should always be. They lived out their remaining years in that same valley, surrounded by children and grandchildren, by neighbors who had become dear friends, by the mountains that had sheltered their love from the very beginning. And when Matthew finally passed peacefully in his sleep in the winter of 1922, at the age of 76, with Caroline's hand held tightly in his own, he did so with a smile on his face. Having spent the last conscious moments of his life telling his wife of 44 years that she had been the truest gift the mountains had ever given him, Caroline followed him 3 years later in the spring of 1925, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, having lived a life that she herself had chosen, every single day, from that first fateful winter when a mountain man had asked her not what others wanted for her, but simply, achingly, what she wanted for herself.